everyone. In today's video, we are going to be discussing excretion and the urinary system. Now, this is a continuation of the systems that we've been talking about where fluids are being transmitted throughout the body. We previously discussed the cardiovascular system, where the fluid that is transporting around the body is blood, and it's going to all of the tissues in the body to transport nutrients, but also to make sure that the cells get oxygen that they need for cellular respiration and remove the carbon dioxide that they don't need. We also talked about the lymphatic system, where we have the circulation of lymph, which has nutrients and waste dissolved in it, but also one of the key mechanisms that white blood cells travel through. So what we're going to be talking about today is the urinary system. So how the liquid, in this case, urine, is traveling through the body and exiting the body. So the first thing that we need to define is what's waste. And waste is anything that your body cannot use or anything that would be considered toxic or dangerous to your body in high quantities. So just from how the term waste is things that you don't need, well, waste when we're talking about the human body is anything that the body doesn't use. So when we're thinking of things that the body doesn't use, well, we know carbon dioxide is one of the wastes, one of the gases that your body doesn't use, and that is a waste of cellular respiration. We also know that feces, undigested food, is a waste of the digestive system because your body can't process those things. So when we're talking about waste, it doesn't necessarily just mean urine, it just means anything that your body can't use. So the types of waste that we have, well, I've already alluded to one of them, carbon dioxide. So it is a waste product of cellular respiration. And again, cellular respiration is how the body makes energy. Right, and it does this in the mitochondria, the organelle that's in the cells. And our chemical equation for cellular respiration, again, would be glucose, which comes from the food that you consume, plus oxygen, which enters the body via the respiratory system. So the nose, then it goes to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli, where it enters into the bloodstream. And then you get, as your products, carbon dioxide, which your body cannot use. So this is a waste product, which is in gas phase, plus water, which your body does use, and it uses it in different chemical processes. And then, of course, energy. Our second type of waste, oh, and of course, it's removed by exhalation via the respiratory system. Our second type of waste is feces, so it's undigested food, and this is more or less a solid phase, and it's removed during excretion in the digestive system, which once we talk about the digestive system, we'll go into a lot more detail about that. Our third type of waste is urine, and that's going to be basically the focus on today's lesson. And urine is basically waste products that are dissolved in the bloodstream. So this can be anything from waste products from cellular respiration. This can be anything of breakdowns of different molecules in the body that were circulating in the bloodstream. And this is a liquid phase. Now, another type of waste, which some of you might not realize, is sweat. So when you sweat, this is usually your body's way of regulating body temperature. But in sweat, there is a few waste minerals that get trapped in the water that is being released. And usually those waste minerals tend to be salts. So if you've accidentally tasted your sweat It tastes salty. So those are some of the waste minerals that get trapped in by the water as it's being removed from your body. And because there are waste minerals that is removed during sweating, this is also considered a mechanism of the urinary system. It's not the key. When you're sweating, you're not losing that many waste products, but it's still a substantial way. So urine. Now, urine, from our diagram that we can see right here, the majority of the component of urine is actually water, which makes sense because if we think about liquids that we have in the body, the main liquid component is going to be water in all biochemical systems, and humans are considered biochemical systems. Water is the main liquid component. So it's 95% water, and then the remaining 5% is our urea, our different trace minerals, and our different trace salts. So we have around other wastes, minerals in excess, and sometimes traces of medications or drugs. And this really depends on the type of drug or medication that you're taking. This is actually why in pro sports, so for instance, the Olympics, one of the ways that the IOC, so the International Olympic Committee, makes sure that athletes are not cheating is that they take not only blood samples, but urine samples, because you can, depending on the drug, find traces of them in the urine. Now, what we're going to talk about a little bit more is what urea is. So urea is actually a mineral. It's a chemical from the breakdown of ammonium. Now, ammonium is actually extremely toxic to the body. So when ammonium does get produced, it very quickly gets broken down into urea. And this process actually happens in the liver. So the liver is an organ in the digestive system, and it produces a lot of enzymes to help break down different molecules. And one of the molecules that it helps breaks down is ammonia into urea. And urea is actually a relatively safe molecule to have in the body. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention is that if there is anything else in your urine besides water, urea, and trace minerals, things like protein, glucose, fat, or red blood cells, it's basically indicative of health problems because these are things that should not end up in urine. And if they do end up in urine, it could mean a series of things that are not functioning properly, like the kidneys are not functioning properly or the liver is not functioning properly. So urea, I mentioned it a little bit in the slide before. It's a waste product when proteins are actually used as an energy source. So the chemical reaction, so the simplistic chemical reaction for how urea is formed is that your amino acids, which are basically the building block of proteins, in the presence of oxygens get burned. So it's an oxidation reaction. So an oxidation reaction is any reaction that involves oxygen, and it produces water, urea, and energy. So urea is not a toxic chemical, but it is a waste product that does need to be released from the body. And this reaction of the producing of urea actually happens in the liver. So this is a diagram of the liver. This thing right here is actually the gallbladder. And the key function of the gallbladder is actually to store bile, which is a chemical that is formed in the liver. So a lot of people can actually have their gallbladder removed if there is issues with the gallbladder, and you're perfectly fine. So one thing people are wondering, well, if urea is colorless, then why is urine yellow? So the yellow color from urine actually comes from a different molecule. And it actually comes from the breakdown of a molecule called urobilin, and urobilin is produced when hemoglobin is decomposed. So remember hemoglobin, this is the molecule on red blood cells to allow it to carry oxygen. So the yellowish color is due to the waste product from the breaking down of urobilin. The waste product of the breaking down of hemoglobin, and the molecule is urobilin. Now, the color of urine actually varies on how much water you have. Naturally, it should be colorless to an amber color. If it is pale, that means you've consumed a lot of water. So the concentration of urobilin in your urine is actually low, which is, good. But if your urine is a dark color, that means you have a high concentration of urobilin. That means you need to drink water because you have not consumed enough water. So we have lots of medical charts. Can look at what color of urine and based on how much water you've consumed. So if it's like a pale yellow, then you're hydrated, which is great. But if it gets darker and darker, right, that means that the body has taken back water. And it also means that you are lacking necessary water. So just, interesting information to note. Now, the urinary system, and this is basically the system that is involved with two things. One, filtering your blood plasma to remove all of the waste products, and two, removing your waste products. So the filtering the blood plasma directly ties into the removing of the waste products, because when you're filtering the blood plasma, the waste that is in the blood gets removed, and then the purified blood continues traveling throughout the entire body. Now, this actually keeps the blood volume constant. So what happens here is that water is either removed or reintroduced to make sure that the blood volume is that constant 5 liters throughout the entire body. And this also maintains blood pressure, because if water needs to go in or out, it's making sure that the blood pressure is adequate so that the blood can flow throughout the entire body. And again, waste products being removed. So if we're looking at the breakdown of the urinary system, it basically is composed of 4 key organs: our kidneys, the ureter, the bladder, and the urethra. Now, the kidneys is where the filtration happens. The ureter is basically the tube that channels urine to the bladder. The bladder basically stores the urine until there's enough to urinate, and the urethra is basically the tube where urine exits the body. Now, obviously, we have blood vessels that are going in, that are supplying blood to the kidneys. So again, our aorta is basically the largest artery in the body that brings blood away from the heart and channels it to different arteries. And the inferior vena cava is the main vein in the lower half of the body that takes blood and brings it back to the heart. The renal artery is the artery that supplies blood to the kidneys to get filtered, And then the renal vein is the vein that channels the filtered blood into the inferior vena cava. So this is basically a zoom in of the actual organs that we were talking about. So the vena cava brings blood back to the heart. The aorta brings blood away from the heart. And the aorta splits off into the renal artery so that the blood goes through the kidneys. And then once the blood has been purified, it goes into the renal vein, which then flows into the vena cava, but specifically the inferior vena cava because it's the lower half of the body. Now urine, so basically the blood plasma that has removed all of the wastes, forming the urine, travels down the ureter into the bladder. In the bladder, it basically accumulates until it exits the body via the urethra. So if we're looking at the filtration of blood in a little bit more detail, there's basically two key steps. The first step is right here, is that blood with wastes go into the kidneys. And again, our renal artery is the blood vessel that goes into the kidneys. Now, because you have two kidneys, you have two renal arteries. The right renal artery goes to the right kidney. The left renal artery goes to the left kidney. Then the filtration of the blood, so here, happens at the kidney. And the filtration component happens in a structure called the nephron. Now, when the blood is filtered, it leaves the kidney via the renal vein, and our urine, so the waste, so the liquid with all of the waste products, go to the bladder via the ureter. So if we're looking at it in steps, step 1, blood flows into the kidneys. Step 2, blood is filtered by the nephrons. Waste goes to the bladder. And purified blood leaves the kidneys. So what we're going to do right now is we're just going to look a little bit into more detail on the nephron. So we have our diagram of our kidney. We can see that we have our renal artery and our renal vein. And all of these little loops right here is your nephron. So there are thousands of nephrons in your kidneys, and each nephron is the structure where the filtration process takes place. So if we're looking at our zoom in of our nephron, we have our renal artery, and then we have this structure right here called the glomerular, and the glomerular is our quote-unquote filter. And the reason why I call it the quote-unquote filter is because this is where particles that, well, it acts as a sieve separating particles that can leave the blood and go into urine and particles that need to stay in the blood. So it acts as a semi-permeable filter because it prevents things like proteins and glucose from leaving the blood, and it allows things like waters and salts to exit the blood. Now, our second structure is the tubule. And the tubule, this is where substances re-enter the blood. And when we're talking about substances that re-enter the blood, things like water. So the water would have left the blood at the glomerulus, and then as the substances are traveling through the tubule, it would actually re-enter the bloodstream. And how it re-enters it is a cascade of hormones that trigger the nephron to reabsorb water. Also, you can have things like salts re-entering the blood. So if specific salt levels are too high or too low, well, if it's too high, it would stay in the tubule and then eventually become urine. But if it's too low, then again, you have a cascade of hormones that would basically trigger the tubule to reabsorb those salts. So what happens is, like, after the liquid has gone through the tubule, anything that remains in the bloodstream is your purified blood. So it leaves the kidney via the renal vein. And anything that stays in the tubule, that becomes your urine. And then that basically exits the body. So if we're looking at this in our key steps, the nephrons sense what you need, and anything that you need gets reabsorbed. So these are things like water, salts, and things that you don't need. And anything that you don't need forms your urine. So things that you don't need would be your wastes, and that's pretty much it. The glomerulus is your filter, so it prevents your large molecules like protein, glucose, and blood cells from exiting, which is also why if these things are found in your urine, it's indicative that there is a problem with your kidneys, because your glomerulus is to prevent these things from leaving the bloodstream. And the tubule is where reabsorption happens. So anything that gets reabsorbed and goes through the bloodstream is your renal vein, which is your purified blood. And anything that remains in your tubule is basically your urine. So this is just basically a more detailed description of your tubule, of your nephron. So we have right here our filter component. And then we have all here the tubule. And then basically all of these things right here are just the different types of salts and waters that get reabsorbed. So as your liquid is going through the tubule, things like potassium, things like water, things like sodium chloride, so table salt, get removed if, again, these levels are too low and need to stay into the bloodstream. If the levels are too high, then it would basically stay in the tubule, and then anything that remains right here forms your urine. Now, the pathway of urine is pretty straightforward. Starts at the kidneys, then it travels through the ureter. It accumulates in the bladder, and then when the bladder gets full, it leaves the body via the urethra. So that is basically excretion and the urinary system in a nutshell. Thanks for watching.